In this module, I want to talk about how to winsomely advocate for biblical sexuality. Now, at first, that may seem to be quite difficult because biblical sexuality is so different than what is being expressed in our culture here in the United States. But I think you'll find that we can once again talk about basic presuppositions and how they make a great deal of sense, especially in the midst of all the chaos that is resulting from the sexuality that surrounds us here in the United States. So again, I think our goal should be not to immediately change the minds of those that we are talking to, but rather to gently challenge one or more of their presuppositions, those things that are on the foundational level of their beliefs, specifically regarding sexuality, and have them hopefully begin to rethink their thoughts and their approach to human sexuality. And again, in this module, we're going to concentrate on advocating for a biblical sexuality, but we will bring up some of the harms of sexuality if practiced outside of the confines of marriage, as is commanded in the Bible. I want to begin again with our two foundational worldviews, because it's critical to bring those to mind and to be thinking about those as we address this very important issue. Again, we start with the created worldview, which says that the world has a preset structure because it is designed. And by being designed, it has this built-in structure. It has built-in values as well. And going against those preset values or that preset structure is what brings harm to the individual. And this is really critical when it comes to the topic of human sexuality, and I'll go into that a little bit more. And finally, because there is preset values and a preset structure, our goal, if we want to flourish as human beings, is to conform ourselves to those values, to that preset structure, so that we minimize the harm that we will bring to ourselves. That's as opposed to the accidental worldview, which again says that the world, the universe, came into being completely by accident, without any type of design or designer. Therefore, there are no inherent values because there's no inherent structure to the universe. The universe and all of the world, including us, simply consists of raw material, atoms and molecules that have come together through evolution to form animals and human beings. And so therefore, the goal of humans is to use this raw material to create the life they want, and specifically sexuality, to get as much pleasure as they want. So when we look in greater depth at the differences between the worldviews when it comes to the topic of human sexuality, we see that in the Christian worldview, sexuality is to be expressed through very specific boundaries. And that is really the context of a marriage between a man and a woman. But in the accidental worldview, the boundaries for expressing sexuality are in fact rapidly disappearing in our culture today, so that there's fewer and fewer boundaries that exist. In the Christian worldview, human sexuality is seen as an expression of love, commitment, and also important because of its procreative value. It creates the family, children and grandchildren, and continues our legacy moving forward. These are tremendous values that we hold within the Christian worldview. Whereas from the accidental worldview, the main value is pleasure. Yes, later on they may take on the values of creating a family, but first and foremost, it is for pleasure. Now, the Christian worldview is unique in that it also looks at the issue of human sexuality through a very unique lens. In fact, in the book of Ephesians, Paul compares human sexuality to the picture of Christ and the church. The intimacy that is experienced in sexuality is the same intimacy that is experienced within Christ and between Christ and the church. Whereas In terms of the accidental worldview, there's no greater meaning. There can't be any greater meaning for sex other than the pleasure it brings and then perhaps the family that might result. So, according to the Christian worldview, marriage is the covenant between a man and a woman and where sex should be experienced exclusively. Whereas the accidental worldview looks at marriage as limiting sexuality in often case. Therefore, the likely presuppositions of this accidental worldview when it comes to human sexuality is that, first of all sexuality between consenting adults is acceptable. All that you need to have is two adults, regardless of their biologic sex, consenting to have sex with each other. You could add 3 or 4 or 5. There's no limit to the number, as long as all the adults involved are consenting. Secondly, they would state that no one has the right to place limits on that first presupposition. Therefore, autonomy and pleasure are taking priority over everything else. And those seeking to limit sexuality, as we do in the Christian worldview, are again woefully misinformed. And finally, their belief and their firm presupposition is that all expressions of sexuality will bring equal measures of happiness and fulfillment. But we as Christians know, and we only have to look at some of the sociologic literature that's coming out in the studies, that this is not necessarily the case. So eventually you may get this question or a variant of this question, and that is, what's wrong with two gay men who love each other with getting married? Now, as this question is brought to you and asked you, again, a couple of things to think about before you respond. First of all, I want to remind you of the words of Jesus in Matthew 7, verse 6, where he says, "Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs." And in this context, what that means is that if you are talking to somebody who really isn't looking for an answer, but simply is challenging you, then it's no reason to give an answer to them because they're not listening. And then again, in that particular case, you can say, if you really at some point in time would like my thoughts on this particular question, I'm happy to sit down and have that discussion with you at that time. But prior to that, you want to be careful and not throw your pearls before pigs, as Jesus says. The other thing to be careful about is not to give reactive responses. And that's going to be a more difficult thing to hold back from because that's going to be our natural predisposition, especially coming out of the second story. And some examples of reactive responses would be, marriage should only be between a man and a woman. Well, that is a true statement, and it's also what we believe, but that statement in and of itself is not going to carry the conversation very far. You might also say, God never meant for us to engage in homosexuality. Again, a true statement, but not one that is winsome and carries the conversation forward. And the worst one that you could say, and I've unfortunately heard many Christians say, is homosexuality is a sin. That will clearly shut down the conversation right away. So we want to avoid those things, and again, take it to the foundational level. So what are some examples of things that we can say as Christians that would move this conversation to the foundational level? Well, again, I would begin with your own personal beliefs. Something along the lines of, you believe that we are created beings, because we are. In fact, you might add that I believe that all human beings are created in the image of God, and that also includes you. Then I would add to that because we are created by God, and sexuality is part of that creation, that God actually created us as sexual beings. But God created us as sexual beings and for that sex to be expressed within certain contexts. Another thing you can add to this is that you believe that God has created us so that we experience the greatest fulfillment and joy with sex when we conform to the design that God has given us. And for instance, you might add, I know of many people who have experienced tremendous emotional pain because they have engaged in sex outside of the covenant of marriage. Because this is so controversial, I would encourage you to add on an analogy that I have frequently used when teaching about this in Sunday school, because I've taught people who raise the question about what's wrong with homosexuality. And I like the analogy of looking at cars. We all own a car. We all have a car. We typically all drive a car. And we all would acknowledge that cars are created and thus are designed to function in a certain way. There are some things a car can do, and there are some things a car cannot do. So I don't think anybody who values their car would say that it's perfectly fine to drive that car into a flooded street, for instance. If we understand engines, we understand that what's going to happen is that engine will get flooded, the car will stop where it is, and damage will occur to that car engine. Another example would be to take the attitude that it's not important for us to make sure that the engine has oil in it. We might, for instance, adopt the view or presupposition that oil is just optional. An engine doesn't need it. I think it's probably part of what happens with oil companies. So therefore, we ignore adding and checking the oil on a regular basis. And we might even ignore the check oil light when it comes on the dashboard, because we think that it's really all part of a conspiracy for the oil companies to get more money. And we don't put oil in. And then eventually, if once again we understand engines, we understand that when the engine runs out of oil, it will freeze and permanent damage will be done to that engine. So harm comes when we don't follow the design of the car. And I believe that God has created our sexuality in a very similar way, that we bring harm to ourselves when we utilize or express our sexuality outside of the confines of the context that God has given us, and that is of a covenantal marriage between a man and a woman. So it isn't as if God is sitting up on his throne in heaven and waiting for us to go outside his commands and then suddenly saying, I'm going to punish you as a result of that. It's really that he set up this design ahead of time, knowing that we would be drawn to express our sexuality outside of marriage, but warning us ahead of time, you don't want to do that because you're only going to bring harm to yourself. And I would say that it's possible you may want to add that this is what you want to teach your patients as well, as you interact with them, because there are inherent harms when they engage in sexual expression outside of a marriage between a man and a woman. Depending on the conversation and the way that you want to carry it forward, you may want to also add at this point the harms of homosexuality. There are well known, and I will put something in the resources that will give you links to these harms. Again, depending on the context and how you want to carry the conversation forward. So now I'm going to ask you to stop the video and spend some time role-playing these conversations. And because these issues are so common, you might know of several stories that you can add. You may want to make some changes or make your own analogy. You don't need to use, obviously, my analogy with the car. You may come up with your own analogy. But spend some time developing how you would respond to the question, what's wrong with two gay men who love each other getting married? Now that you've addressed the issue of homosexuality, I now want to address actually a more common problem that is coming into the church itself. And that is the essence of the question, are you saying it's wrong for me as a man to live with my girlfriend before we get married? Or what's wrong with a couple living together, a man and a woman, before they get married, just to make sure they're compatible? variations along this theme. And again, we need to be careful as we enter into this particular discussion. You want to know for sure, is the person that's bringing this up, do they really want to know your answer to that? Do they want to know what you have to say about it? If you're unsure, again, there's several things you could say. You could say, are you really interested in my answer, or have you already made up your mind? Or you can say, I'm happy to discuss this sometime later, again, when we have more time, or it's in a different context. But what would be some winsome responses to that particular question or issue of a man and a woman living together prior to becoming married? Well, I would start out by saying that it's difficult to go against the flow of society, and I understand that. And everyone else is doing it. Marriage is becoming, unfortunately, less and less common, and it's becoming more and more common for a man and a woman to live together before they make the final commitment for marriage. But I would add to that, again, your belief along the lines that you believe that God has given us a wonderful gift in sexuality, one that brings us unbelievable pleasure if used in the right way. But because it brings us great pleasure, it also can bring us great pain, because God, again, designed human sexuality to be expressed within the confines of a marriage between a man and a woman. And the other thing to recognize and point out is that when we engage in sexual activity with another person, we become emotionally bonded to that person, even if we're not married, even if we barely know that person, because that's the way God has created sex. He has created sex to increase our emotional bond to our sex partner. And so when we have and express our sexuality outside of a covenantal relationship of marriage, then and that relationship then ends, the pain that's experienced is exponentially increased because of the sexuality that makes up that relationship. So that's really one of the major reasons that God tells us that we need to confine our sexual activity to the covenant of marriage, which is a lifelong covenant between two people. Remember the phrase that we always or usually hear in the wedding ceremony itself, till death do us part. And it's only within the covenant of marriage between a man and a woman that we can share the intimacy of sex within the safety of an emotional relationship, knowing that we are committed to each other for the rest of our lives. And I am thankful that I can say that from personal experience, having been married for over 45 years. So there's something very special about knowing that your spouse has never also experienced that intimacy with anyone else. So those are some of the winsome responses that you can have regarding the question of whether or not to engage in sexual activity with someone prior to marriage. But depending on the context and the person you're talking to and your relationship with them, you may want to add in a couple of additional factors, and that would include the issue that's not often talked about, and that is of sexually transmitted infections, and certainly the issue of becoming pregnant before you're ready to become pregnant. That isn't as much of a concern within the covenantal relationship of marriage, but certainly outside of marriage, those are two very important issues that can come up and become a negative impact from engaging in sex prior to marriage. So I want you to, again, at this time, to break into your small groups and try and personalize your response with a story, because in today's world, sex outside of marriage is so common, there's no doubt that you know of stories. And that story may be your own story. It may be something that you experienced before becoming a Christian. But the essence of the story should revolve around a sexual relationship that occurred outside of marriage and emphasize the pain that it brought one or both of the individuals involved. And if it happens to be a personal story of your own life, I think it's important for you to add, I think you would agree that it's probably some of the worst emotional pain that you've ever experienced, and that emotional pain was enhanced because of the sexual nature of the relationship. And then again, you might think through whether or not to add the components of a sexually transmitted infection to that story, unwanted pregnancy, or the shame that's brought about with that. And I would encourage you to end the story with an observation of regret that engaging in sexual activity prior to marriage oftentimes does bring a great amount of pain. So spend some time among yourselves discussing these examples, working off of each other and role-playing, and the outcomes of these sexual relationships that you might discuss with friends or acquaintances that are considering becoming involved in a sexual relationship. And role-play these stories as much as possible with each other until you reach the point where you feel comfortable responding to this important question from either a friend or perhaps an acquaintance.